Hi guys, and welcome to the cardiovascular system. So when we are looking in this system, we know that cardio means heart and vascular means blood vessels. So we're going to be looking at both the heart and the blood vessels. So your heart is actually located probably differently than what you've been told your entire life. If you've ever been told to hold your hand over your heart, you've probably put it over more a little bit towards your left pec. But your heart is actually located right in the center, right in that mediastinum in the inferior portion. There is a pericardial cavity that houses this heart. It is about 14 centimeters long and about 9 centimeters wide, and it is slightly diagonal in orientation. And in 1 year, the heart will actually pump enough blood to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool. But it is a hollow muscular organ, and it's approximately the size of your fist. It's located right in between your lungs in the inferior mediastinum. The apex is known as the tip, whereas the base is going to be the other side of the heart that will be more superior. But the apex is that tip, and it is actually kind of pointed towards the left hip, and the base will point towards the right shoulder. And there are a lot of large blood vessels that are going to attach here. And on average, the heart contracts anywhere between 70 to 72 or 75 times per minute. It varies though. Here we have an X-ray and the location on the diaphragm. In the location, you can see that it sits right on top of the diaphragm. So you can see that diaphragm here that creates the separation between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. You can also see that diaphragm here and the outline of where the heart is located. And then I really like this diagram because it shows you the sections on the X-ray and then what it actually looks like in the cadaver. So you can see the attachment of some blood vessels, which are here, and then you can see the tip of the heart that is here, the apex. And here is just another picture in the X-ray, looking at both posterior and anterior view of where the heart is located. So we learned about 3 serous membranes. The ones that we've learned about already are the peritoneum, the pericardium, and the pleura. So this was back in 202 when you were learning about the tissues and the membranes. Well, the pericardium is a serous membrane that covers the heart. It is a double layered sac. So you can see here if this is zooming into this section of the heart, and you can see that this is actual cardiac muscle here. And then you have the pericardial cavity that is surrounding that heart. So that is going to have 2 different layers. Those layers are the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium. So, for example, a reference is in the abdominal cavity. There is the peritoneum, and that peritoneum has the parietal peritoneum that lines the body cavities, and then it has the visceral peritoneum that lines the visceral organ. And we're going to have the same thing here. But first, we have to create the cavity because the heart is inside of the thoracic cavity, and more specifically, it's inside of that inferior mediastinum. So we have to create a cavity for the pericardium. So you have what's called the fibrous pericardium, which is the superficial layer. It is a connective tissue structure that provides a cavity that the heart will sit in. Then we'll do the same thing we did with the abdominal cavity. The parietal pericardium, this layer here, this layer right there, that is going to line the cavity, or this fibrous pericardium here. And the visceral pericardium is going to be this layer here. Sorry, my laser pointer. This layer here that's actually touching the muscle of the heart. It's going to be on the heart itself, that visceral pericardium. And then in between the fibrous pericardium and the visceral pericardium, you're going to see some fluid. And the fluid between the layers is a serous fluid that's called pericardial fluid. And that is a lubricating fluid which will reduce friction in the heart every time that heart contracts. It'll allow movement in a frictionless environment. So this is a really good picture where you can actually see that pericardium being cut away. It is a very fibrous connective tissue. The fibrous pericardium that is actually making that sac. So you can see here, if we zoom into this pericardial cavity, you'll see that this fibrous layer will kind of loop around and form that epicardium layer. So they are the same layer, the fibrous layer and the parietal pericardium. So the most similar analogy that I can always think of is with an actual balloon. So if you were to blow that balloon up with some air and put your fist into it, you could push one side of that balloon towards the other side of the balloon. And when your hand would basically be like your heart. So there's going to be this layer that actually touches your hand, and that layer is the visceral pericardium. And then the layer that makes up the outside of the balloon, that is going to be the parietal pericardium, which is also that fibrous layer creating the pericardial cavity. And then in between those layers, we have air in the balloon, we'll have the pericardial fluid, that serous fluid in between those two layers. So the heart itself is actually composed of 3 layers. The outermost layer, it's going to be shown as this layer right here. This is called the epicardium. Epi means covering or outer, and cardium's heart. So this is that outermost layer of the heart. And it is also that visceral pericardium that we just talked about. They are the same layer. But when we're talking about body cavities, it'll be referred to as the visceral pericardium. But then when we're talking about the layers of the heart, it's going to be referred to as the epicardium. But this outer layer will have connective tissue, and it'll have some adipose in some parts, but it will house the blood vessels and lymph. The thicker inner layer in the middle, that houses blood vessels and, that is the cardiac muscle. And so the cardiac muscle is actually these twisted bundles that will spiral around the heart. And then this innermost layer, these parts where you see them going up and down, that layer is the endocardium. Endo means inner. So this is a really thin layer of some connective tissue and epithelium that is going to be continuous with the endothelium of blood vessels that are entering the heart. And it's also going to contain a specialized structure called Purkinje fibers, which we will talk about. So notice when looking at the pericardium, We said it was the visceral pericardium, and then the same layer is now labeled as the epicardium. Okay, see, so now this diagram that we just had, now it is labeled as the epicardium. So when talking about the heart layers, it's referred to as the epicardium. And then if we're talking about those body cavities, or if we are talking about the pericardium, it will be referred to as the visceral pericardium, but it is the same layer. This is another great image to show you that they are actually the same thing. So you can see the layers of the heart here. This is that endocardium layer. You got that thick myocardium. And then we have this outer layer here. That's the epicardium and the visceral pericardium. And then the pericardial cavity, and then the parietal pericardium. Here is those layers of the heart and what it looks like in a cadaver, that innermost layer, and then the thick myocardium, and then you can see the epicardium there. And another cool thing about myocardium and heart muscle is we're looking at the base of the heart there, and notice the spiral pattern. It has to spiral so that way when the heart beats, it's almost like the heart is wringing itself. Like if you were to take a wet rag and twist it and wring it, when the heart beats, it beats in that same kind of twisting or wringing manner. And within the heart muscle, there is a fibrous skeleton. It's not bone that provides a lot of the function. It will also have valves, and these valves will have rings around this fibrous tissue and around them. The tissue helps insulate the atrium and the ventricles, so that way when there is an impulse in the heart, it will go through these structures called Purkinje fibers, and it's coordinated like it's supposed to, and it doesn't have the ability to go all willy-nilly or all crazy. It will be a pattern. And so those fibrous rings that go around the valves are called annuli fibrosi, and those will help keep the valves open, and it will prevent them from stretching out extensively. This is a really good picture that you can look at, and you can notice that the valves, there is a solid ring around them. And that solid ring is part of this fibrous skeleton. And you can see it in the cadaver heart here. And then you can see over here in this heart, there are valves, and those valves are being connected or held down to the myocardium by these cords called chordae tendineae. So the human heart has 4 chambers. Atria is plural, and atrium is singular. And those are going to be located in the base at the top of the heart. And they will receive blood. So everything in the heart is, or in this lecture, it's going to be in groups of 4. So the 2 other chambers are ventricles. These are going to be down on the bottom by the apex, and they are going to pump blood out of the heart. And the blood will enter through these arteries here and pump the blood back out. And so the right and the left sides of the heart act like separate pumps, where the right side of the heart will receive deoxygenated blood in the right atrium from body tissues. We'll go over what those blood vessels are. And the left atrium will receive oxygenated blood from pulmonary veins on the right side. And then there's going to be this septum or wall that will prevent the oxygenated blood and the deoxygenated blood from mixing. And one thing I also want to note, because it gets a lot of students, is to remember that when you're looking at the heart, the sides are going to appear switched, because when we're talking about the heart, we're referring to the patient's anatomical position, which is opposite for you if you are looking at the heart. So while this is on your right side, it is the patient's left side. So this is the left atrium and the left ventricle. Here's an anterior view of the chambers of the heart. So you can see, so looking anteriorly in the chest, there's this really large blood vessel right here. That's the aorta. And so the right atrium is going to be to the right and a little inferior, where the right ventricle is going to be that area below it. And then I want you to note this section right here that is separating the right ventricle from the left ventricle. That is called the interventricular sulcus, and it's a really nice landmark to note the anterior portion of the heart. And then if you try to look at the left atrium, you can't really see it in the anterior view. You can just kind of see the top portion of it. And then if we're looking at the back of the heart, we have the right atrium, which we can barely see, but we can now definitely see more of that left atrium. And I want you to notice those two pulmonary veins entering in that location, because that's a really good indicator of the left atrium, right? We won't see that. If I go back to the right atrium, we won't see that. And then you can see a little bit of the right ventricle, but you can see a lot more of the left ventricle. So the atria are the receiving chambers, and their walls are going to be a little thinner. On the outside of the heart, there is also this structure called an auricle, which means ear, that covers them. And it's a lot of adipose tissue and connective tissue that's going to function to protect those thin-walled atria. While the ventricles are the pumping chambers, so they're going to have much thicker walls. This is an image as if you took a transverse section of the heart, cutting it into inferior and superior portions. And so we made an incision right through those ventricles, and notice the wall of the right ventricle versus the wall of the left ventricle. It's much thicker. And that's because the right ventricle is going to pump blood to the lungs through this structure here, but the left ventricle has to pump blood to the entire body, and it will pump it out through this structure, the aorta here. And so the word for wall is septum or septa. It's plural. There are the interventricular septum, which is going to separate the two ventricles, and interatrial septum, which will separate the two atria. And then there is these internal ridges inside of the ventricles called trabeculae carnae. And the thought is that these trabeculae carnae may prevent the ventricle walls from sticking to each other when they contract. And sometimes there can be people born with a hole in the heart. And what that means is that blood can cross, oxygenated and deoxygenated blood can cross into the other ventricle. And that also creates a problem with the suction when the heart is trying to create a pressure system to deliver that oxygen. There's not as much suction available to create that pressure. And so here you can see the interventricular septum that is separating the left and right atrium. And then you can see here we have the interatrial septum that's separating the right atrium from the left atrium. And take a note of the ligamentum arteriosum. And that's this portion right here, this little ligament that attaches the aorta. This is the aorta, and this is the pulmonary artery. You have blood that will leave the right atrium and go through the pulmonary trunk, and then that pulmonary trunk will separate into the right and left pulmonary artery to go to the right and left lungs. And then there's this little guy right here. If we can identify that on a dissection, that would be amazing. So looking at the external anatomy of the heart, there are a couple structures other than that ligament here that we're going to want to be able to identify. There is the atrioventricular sulcus, also known as the coronary sulcus, which is going to be located right here. And this is going to separate the atria up here from the ventricles down here. And then you're going to see these ear-like flaps that are also good landmarks for your atria. And then the marker that is going to overlie the interventricular septum, dividing the right and left ventricles, is this interventricular sulcus here. And these sulci are important because they contain coronary arteries. And looking at this, if we can see that atrioventricular sulcus and we can see that interventricular sulcus with all these arteries, we know that we're looking at the anterior view of the heart. So we're going to also be able to locate the atrium because it's going to be underneath this structure here. This is the auricle. And then going into that atria is going to be our pulmonary veins. Remember, veins return blood to the heart, while arteries take blood away from the heart. So the right atrium is going to receive deoxygenated blood from the bodies, and it's covered by this auricle. While over on the left atrium, this will receive oxygenated blood from the lungs, and it will be covered by another auricle. The largest blood vessel that's going to come off of the heart is the aorta, and you'll see that there are 3 blood vessels that come off of that, which we'll go over. The pulmonary trunk that is going to deliver deoxygenated blood to the lungs is going to branch out, and we will have the right and left pulmonary arteries. And then we have the large blood vessel that's going to return deoxygenated blood to the atrium from the lower part of the body, called the inferior vena cava. And then we have the superior vena cava that will return deoxygenated blood to that atrium from the upper portion of the body. Here is an image on a real heart of that anterior interventricular sulcus and of that coronary sulcus. So this will separate the atria from the ventricles, and then this interventricular sulcus will separate the right and left ventricles. Looking at the posterior view of the heart, this is where we're going to be able to see the superior vena cava and that inferior vena cava, how they do actually merge, and they both will deliver that deoxygenated blood to the right atrium. So directly below that is going to be the right ventricle. And when that ventricle contracts, it will squeeze its blood into the pulmonary trunk, which we cannot see in this image, but that pulmonary trunk will divide into these pulmonary arteries. Blood will then pick up oxygen and return to the left atrium through the pulmonary veins, And there are 2 right pulmonary veins and 2 left pulmonary veins. And then that blood will be able to go down into the left ventricle. And here you can see that coronary sulcus that is carrying blood vessels, separating the atria that are up here from those ventricles. And another posterior view of a real heart. This is showing the posterior view of the interventricular sulcus, separating the right and left ventricles, and the posterior view of the coronary sulcus, separating these atria from the ventricles. And so there are some major internal structures of the heart, one of those being valves. And so valves are kind of like a set of swinging doors. They're going to allow the blood to only flow in one direction, and they're not going to be able to open the other way. And so this will prevent backflow when the heart pumps. Certain valves will open to allow the blood to go through, moving the blood forward. And of course, there are 4 valves. We have atrioventricular valves, or AV valves, that are going to be between the atria and the ventricles. And so on the right side of the heart, we have the tricuspid valve that gets its name because it has 3 flaps of tissue. And then on the left side of the heart, we're going to have the bicuspid or the mitral valve, and those have 2 flaps of tissue. And then we're also going to have valves between the ventricles and blood vessels. So on the right side of the heart, between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk here, there is going to be a semilunar valve called the pulmonary semilunar valve. And that should make sense because it's going to leave the ventricles and it's going to go to the lungs. And on the left side of the heart, we have a valve that's also a semilunar valve between the left ventricle and the aorta. That is called the aortic valve. And these are called semilunar because they are in the shape of half moons. So blood flow is what opens and closes these valves. Okay, so blood flow is what opens and closes these valves. So these valves are anchored in place by chordae tendineae, these tough cords that look like strings that are anchored into the heart muscle and connected to those valves. And when the heart relaxes, those chordae tendineae aren't being pulled, and so that allows the valves to open when the heart relaxes. And then during ventricular contraction, that is going to close these valves. The semilunar valves, though, those are going to be closed during relaxation. And during ventricular contraction, those valves will open. And so the AV valves and the semilunar valves are going to operate opposite of one another. And that's going to force a one-way path of blood through the heart. And what's going to open and close these valves is blood flow. So when the pressure in a chamber is high enough, the pressure is going to push against these valves. And the blood flowing against the valves will cause them to open. When the pressure is low in the chamber and there isn't blood pushing on these valves to open, the valves will relax, the chambers will relax, and that will cause the valves to close. Valves opening and closing is caused by blood flow. Blood flow is caused by the pressure in the chamber pushing blood against these valves that will push them open. When the pressure then goes down, the valves will close. And chordae tendineae do not open and close these valves. The chordae tendineae will prevent the valves from opening in the wrong direction when the heart pumps. So these strings are located in the AV valves. The chordae tendineae allow the valve to stay closed during an atrial contraction. And so here, if we can find the mitral and the tricuspid valves here, you can see these tendinous cords that are the chordae tendineae. And at the top of the ventricles, we can see this semilunar valve here. That's the pulmonary valve that leads to the pulmonary trunk. And then that pulmonary trunk will branch out into the pulmonary arteries. I always think about it like a tree. A tree will have a trunk, and then it will have some branches, and those branches are the pulmonary arteries. But notice that these semilunar valves, no chordae tendineae. So attached to the papillary muscles, if you look here, we have the papillary muscles right here. You have these little like projection looking things, and those are the trabeculae carnae. And those will contract during ventricular contraction, and that will tug on these chordae tendineae, keeping the valve closed and preventing the blood from pushing the valve open and going back up into the atria, preventing that backflow. Here we have an image where you can see the interventricular septum. You can see that interatrial septum. And then we've got that chordae tendineae here that is connected to the papillary muscles. And then those papillary muscles are connected to the trabeculae carnae. And this is a picture of those atrioventricular valves. We have the tricuspid valve that is on the left side of the right side of the heart, and then the bicuspid or mitral valve on the left side. And you can know it's the left side because there's that thick myocardium showing you that it's the left ventricle. And here we have a different cut of the heart, so you can see those semilunar valves. So this is going to be the pulmonary trunk here, and you can see that this is actually the right ventricle, and so the blood flow will go bloop through those valves. And here you have blood that will go from the left ventricle up through those aortic semilunar valves into the aorta. And this is the same thing I showed you earlier, but you can see that the mitral valve and the tricuspid valve have those chordae tendineae attached. And then you can see the 2 valves versus the 3 valves there. Here is an image of the aortic valve. It will always be the largest blood vessel, and there is no chordae tendineae. This is a picture of the tricuspid valve, and so you can definitely see those tendinous cords of the chordae tendineae, and then that papillary muscle there, here, and then the trabeculae carnae. And here is a good image of some interior features of the heart, where we have the trabeculae carnae, we've got the septum, the atria, and the ventricles. And so the heart pumps blood, and blood vessels allow the blood to circulate to all parts of the body. The cardiovascular system is a closed system of the heart and those blood vessels. And just like a transport system, it's going to deliver that blood. But this transport system has two separate pumps. It has the right side of the heart to deliver blood to your lungs for them to drop off carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. This blood, or this pump, I should say, this pump puts blood into the pulmonary circuit. Okay, and so that's being represented here in this top section of this diagram. The left side of your heart, though, this portion of the heart, that is going to deliver oxygenated blood to the body systems. So this is called the systemic circuit, and this is where that oxygen can be delivered to all the tissues for use in cellular respiration. And then carbon dioxide will get picked up by the blood from those body tissues, and it will be delivered back to the right side of the heart to then enter into the pulmonary circuit and drop off that carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. And so the function of the cardiovascular system is to deliver oxygen and nutrients and to remove waste and carbon dioxide. So think about the flow of oxygen and the flow of carbon dioxide. Remember that your cells require oxygen for cellular respiration and the product and to make energy. And your cells have to use a specific form of energy called adenosine triphosphate. And they can make that from cellular respiration, but they gotta have oxygen. Carbon dioxide is going to be released as a waste product. So that has to be circulated back to the lungs so it can be released and exhaled out of the body. And so these two circuits, the left side will deliver oxygenated blood to the tissues and deoxygenated blood to the right side of the heart. And so the pulmonary circuit, the main blood vessels that are going to be attached to the heart is going to be the pulmonary trunk. And that pulmonary trunk will then branch out into the right and left pulmonary arteries. And then that deoxygenated blood will go to both of the lungs where it will pick up oxygen. And then it will be returned back to the heart, specifically the left atrium, and that now has oxygen. And so it returns by pulmonary veins. A lot of students associate with arteries having oxygenated blood and veins have deoxygenated blood. But please note, in this system, it's opposite. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, while veins carry blood towards the heart. So in the pulmonary circuit, the blood going away from the heart in a pulmonary artery is deoxygenated, and the blood returning to the heart by a vein is oxygenated. Where the systemic circuit, the main blood vessel that's going to be attached to the heart is going to be the aorta, and that is going to be the biggest blood vessel coming off of the base of the heart, and it receives blood from this lower chamber here, the ventricle. And then that aorta will branch out and deliver oxygen to all of the tissues. And then that will get used in the tissues and carbon dioxide will be picked up and it will return to the the right atria. And there are two major blood vessels. They're both called vena cava, and blood vessels will collect from the superior part of your body in the superior vena cava, and then there'll be that blood vessel coming from all of the structures in the lower part of your body called the inferior vena cava, but it will indeed go to this right atria. And what we have here, we have blood filling the heart. The ventricles is these ventricles are going to be forced to contract. And when they do, that contraction will start at the base and work its way up, and it will increase pressure in these ventricles. And that pressure will force the blood out of the heart. At that time, the atria are relaxed, and that relaxation of the atria will allow blood to enter the atria. And the blood flow will continue to fill up those atria, and then it will increase pressure, and that blood flow will put pressure on those AV valves, and then those will open as that pressure begins to build in the atria. Well, then the atria is going to contract to ensure that the atria is fully empty. And we also want to make sure that these ventricles are completely full. So now with the ventricles full, they will contract. And as they contract, pressure is going to build and get higher and higher inside of those ventricles. The blood is going to get shoved against the valves. The mitral valve and the bicuspid valve, though, they've got that chordae tendineae. So even though blood's pushing hard against those valves, the cords are also being pulled. And because they're attached to the papillary muscles, the papillary muscles also contracting and pulling those cords, preventing them from opening. So no blood can get back up into the atria. However, the aortic valves do not have, and pulmonary valves do not have chordae tendineae. So when the blood pushes against these semilunar valves, they will open and blood will be able to move forward through into those two systems instead of going backwards. So now the ventricles are going to empty and we can start all over again. So that's where we're going to close it and end it for today. But next up will be systemic and pulmonary circulations and internal heart conduction.